Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I am going to be doing a more discussion-based video, one that was actually suggested by a commenter. I recently put out a community post asking if anybody had some requests for videos that they would like to see, because I was trying to come up with some videos that I could do, and I wanted to see if there were any that any of you particularly wanted to see. So if you have any more ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments, but this was requested by Janny Johnson. And he said that he would like to see a video about my journey as a reader, where I started out, what got me into reading, and kind of the progression from there. And this is a video that I figured I would probably make at some point or another, but since it was specifically requested, I figured I'd do it now. So starting out, the first thing that really got me into reading, I grew up in a very religious family. My dad was a pastor for 13 years. So obviously, growing up, I read the Bible a lot. I don't really count that because, that's more religious, whereas, this is more in terms of fiction. But I guess if you want to count that, then you can. But in terms of fiction, the first stuff that I read was, I believe, The Chronicles of Narnia. It was either that or Deltora Quest, and those are both children's fantasy series. I'm not sure which one I got into first, but I do remember how I got into both of them. So I'll start with Narnia, because I think that's what I got into first. So Narnia, I'm pretty sure I didn't get into until the first movie came out. The first of like the more recent, like the 2000s movies by Disney. Or the first two were by Disney and the third one was by someone else, but those movies. And the first one was coming out, and I think I was like at McDonald's or something, and I saw a promotion for it, and I was like, that looks cool. So I watched the movie eventually, and then I got the books. And so like over time, I didn't get all the books at once or anything, but like I would get a few, and like my mom or my grandmother would get me some other ones, and eventually I got all of them. And I read those many, many times growing up. I also reread them recently a few months ago. I have a ranking for Narnia on my channel if you have not seen it. When I finished rereading the series, I did that video. And in terms of Deltora Quest, I got into that one kind of partway through the series, because I want to say it was in my third grade class. So I guess at that point I probably would have been into Narnia first, but I think in my third grade classroom, there was like a bookshelf with a whole bunch of books on it that students could take and read. And I was looking through them one day, and I found the third book of Deltora Quest called City of the Rats, I believe. And I read it, and I really enjoyed it, and then I found out there were more books in the series. I can't remember if there were any other ones that I had read before getting all of them, but I got a box set of all of the books. Some of you who kind of grew up kind of in the 2000s like I did might remember like the Scholastic book fairs, and there would be like different catalogs of books that you could order from, I can't remember if it was from Scholastic or somewhere else, I think it was. And they had a box set of the full main Deltora Quest series. And so I got that, and I read the whole series again several times, and I loved it. And I also read some of the follow-up books. There were two more series, Deltora Shadowlands and Dragons of Deltora. I don't think I read all of the books in those series, but I think I read at least most. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 books in each of those, and I think I read 3 of the Dragons books out of the 4 that I think there are. I can't remember. I read like some of those, but not all of them. And so that's kind of where I got into reading as a kid. It started out with fantasy, so I've always kind of been very interested in fantasy, even though I didn't really get into adult fantasy until very recently. That kind of interest in it was always there ever since I was a kid. And growing up, in terms of video games and movies, I was always more drawn to the more fantasy or sci-fi leaning stuff, and I attribute at least part of that to Deltora Quest and Narnia, and in terms of sci-fi, to Star Wars, because I grew up on Star Wars as well. So moving forward throughout the rest of elementary school and into middle school and all that stuff, as far as I can remember, Most of the books that I read in terms of fiction were usually for school. But there were some other ones that I read a lot as a kid. I read some choose your own adventure books. I really liked that style of books, which I think has kind of rubbed off on me in another way in terms of I play a lot of video games, and I really enjoy video games that are more like role playing games, and you can kind of make choices and stuff. And I think my love of that kind of started with choose your own adventure books because I really enjoyed those. So I read kind of the regular choose your own adventure books. There were some Indiana Jones ones that I liked, stuff like that, stuff that I would just kind of find at the school library that I would check out. Really enjoyed Diary of a Wimpy Kid because that was coming out when I was a kid. So I read those a whole lot. I had up until I think like the fifth book or something like that. I had those, and I read those a lot, and I really enjoyed those. Stuff like that. There was some other stuff I read. There was some like the junior novelizations of various different movies. I had them for the original 6 Star Wars movies. I remember I had one for Spider-Man 3, Batman Begins, stuff like that. Novelizations of some movies that I liked, and some different things like that. Also in middle school read The Last Dragon Chronicles, which is again kind of a children's fantasy series. Probably more so middle grade than like a children's fantasy in the vein of like Del Toro Quest or something. I'd say it's probably more middle grade aimed, but I haven't read it in a very long time, so I can't say for certain. But I loved those. My teachers, I remember one of my teachers, I knew that I really liked those books, and so when the new one would come out, she would get it for the class, and then she would let me read it like first out of everyone because I liked them. So I also read those in middle school. And of course, you might be thinking, where I grew up around the 2000s and I was kind of into fantasy a little bit, you might be wondering, did you read Harry Potter? I did not read Harry Potter. Again, grew up in a very religious family, and Harry Potter for me and for my family was kind of a taboo thing. It's not something that they approved of. Since then, I have like seen the movies. I haven't read the books. I've listened to a little bit of the audiobooks. But I have not like read beginning to end the series, and I would like to at some point. But I never got into Harry Potter, so there's that. And moving on, the next kind of big thing that I got into was Star Wars books. And of course, I had just mentioned I had already read like the junior novelizations for the first 6 movies. But the first time I had an exposure to the EU in terms of the books was for the Force Unleashed novelization. And that was the only EU that I read for several years. But I had played the video game for the Force Unleashed, and I really enjoyed it. And one day I was into Borders, and I saw that they had the book, and so I was like, I know that story, I'm gonna buy that. And I read it, and my copy of it I don't have currently with me, but it is extremely worn. I have read it many, many times to the point where, probably not right now, but for a while I probably could have quoted like parts of the book to you because I had read it so many times. And so I read that a whole bunch, and then in high school, I started checking out a few more EU books, but not very many. There were only a handful that I actually read in high school. I didn't get really into the EU until more recently, but back in high school I read like the Old Republic tie-in books, which are Revan, Deceived, Fatal Alliance, and Annihilation. And I read those, at least all of them except Annihilation, on ebook. I would get some of these books as ebooks and read them on my school laptop, like during study halls and stuff when I didn't have any homework to do. And Annihilation, my friend had a hardcover that he let me borrow. So I read those. I read the Jedi Academy trilogy, which was actually the first one that I read in terms of the EU, besides The Force Unleashed, which I don't entirely count as my first exposure to the EU in terms of books, because it is a novelization. But my first exposure to like an original EU book was the Jedi Academy trilogy, which, again, my high school had at the library. It was one of the very few Star Wars books that they had. And we had to pick out something to read from the library for class or whatever, and I saw that they had that, and I was like, that says Star Wars, I'm going to read that. And it was just a hardcover bind-up of all 3 books. And so I would check that out frequently, and I would read it and reread it. And then eventually I got them on ebook so I could just read them on my laptop. And then in addition to the Jedi Academy trilogy and the Old Republic books, I also read Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, which is kind of a sequel book to Revenge of the Sith. It takes place very shortly after. It's kind of a part of what I believe is referred to as the Dark Lord trilogy, which is Labyrinth of Evil, the Revenge of the Sith novelization, and then Dark Lord, Rise of Darth Vader. And I enjoyed that one as well, and again, I would read it and reread it. And then basically throughout high school, for all 4 years, I would just read those books and reread them over and over again, along with the stuff that I was required to read for school. But in terms of stuff that I read specifically for school, I don't really remember loving that much of it. Really, all I remember really enjoying was more so in high school. And I mean, I liked a lot of what we read in school. I just don't remember a lot of it. But I remember I read like the Odyssey, which I enjoyed, and Beowulf. I read some Edgar Allan Poe, stuff like that for school. And I enjoyed some of that stuff. I read some Shakespeare, all that. I read like Of Mice and Men and some other ones. Didn't really, care for a lot of it. I mean, a lot of it I thought was okay, but it just didn't really leave an impression on me or anything. But the main stuff that I read for my own entertainment at that point was those few Star Wars books that I had in ebook. And then we come to my college years. I went to college in 2017, and I basically stopped reading for about 3.5 years. Not my entire life at college. I got back into reading during my 4th year at college. But for like 3.5 years, I just didn't read at all in terms of stuff that I wanted to read. Pretty much anything I read was for a class. So I spent a lot of my free time back then, first of all, playing video games because I like video games. That's also when I started writing and releasing my own original music. Which is something that I've been doing for some time. So that obviously took up also a lot of my free time. So I just got into some other stuff, and the reading kind of fell by the wayside. But in early 2021, like in January of 2021, I started a new job working in homes with clients with physical or developmental disabilities as an overnight shift. Those shifts, for the most part, didn't really require me to do a whole lot because a lot of the people that I worked with were fairly independent, or they didn't really require assistance during the night. And so I started reading at those shifts, and that's how I got back into reading, is with that job, because I figured if I'm going to be there and not really going to be doing a whole lot, maybe I should get back into reading. And at that point, the Star Wars The High Republic series was starting. So the first book that got me back into reading was Light of the Jedi. And so I read some Star Wars books, both canon and legends. I read Light of the Jedi, and then I read Into the Dark, I think. I might have read something in between. I know I read the Darth Bane trilogy. That was the first Legends stuff that I read once I got back into reading. I think I read that after Into the Dark, though, but I could be wrong. But at that point, I just started getting more into Star Wars books. I read some canon books, read some Legends books, read the original Thrawn trilogy. I started getting into the New Jedi Order, started getting into the Republic Commando series. I read Lost Stars, Kenobi, a bunch of, I think, the more popular and more kind of essential books for both the canon and Legends. And then later on in 2021, I decided I was going to start checking out some fantasy again, because I really enjoyed those couple of series that I read as a kid. Plus, over that summer, I watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy for the first time, and I loved it. I haven't actually watched them since, but I would consider them among my favorite movies that I've ever seen, and I really want to watch them again. I just haven't made the time for it. So I saw those and I was like, okay, I need to now read the books because that was awesome. So I got a box set that had The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and I read those and loved them. And then that brings us to last year, 2022, which is when I really started digging into fantasy a lot more. Read Brandon Sanderson, love Brandon Sanderson so far. started getting into Wheel of Time, started reading The Witcher, A Song of Ice and Fire, with some Star Wars books sprinkled in, predominantly towards the beginning and end of the year. The rest of the year was mostly fantasy, as well as a bit of Lovecraft and similar horror books. But that's pretty much what I got into last year. And I mean, I started this channel in August, so you probably, if you have seen a lot of my older videos, you probably know what I was into, at least for the second half of last year. So that's kind of what I got into last year. And then this year, you know, I've just been reading. I started reading some more Wheel of Time, read some more Star Wars, and that pretty much brings us to now. So that's pretty much it for this video. Let me know down in the comments kind of what your reading journey has looked like. Was it similar to mine, where you did it some as a kid and then stopped and got back into it again? Or did you just kind of been reading for your entire life? Or did you just never really read until a few years ago and you just kind of got into it like as a teenager or an adult? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear some other people's stories. And that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.